I don't think it'll surprise anyone to hear that I've been very excited for Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, the latest expansion to what is currently my favorite MMO on the market. In my opinion, the past two expansions for FF14 have both been home runs. Shadowbringers is one of my favorite games of all time, and while I'd probably give it the edge over Endwalker, I think Endwalker is a terrific ending to the 10-year saga of Hydaelyn and Zodiark, which is no small feat. At the same time, while Endwalker was a period of unprecedented success for FF14, MMOs don't get more popular in their 10th year running, let alone so much more popular that the servers can't keep up with it and they have to pull the game from sale to slow people down. That's unheard of. Final Fantasy XIV is also in a position of vulnerability right now. While I think they nailed the ending of the arc we've spent years following, that story being over means the future looks uncertain for the game. The next expansion was a bigger question mark than ever before, and leading to the announcement, it felt like we could have gotten anything. What we got was Dawntrail, promising to be the best summer vacation ever, giving us a new land to explore, the new world, Taral, far to the west of Eorzea. A whole civilization that's just barely in communication with the world we know. Dawntrail is positioning itself as the beginning of a whole new arc, and that is a tricky needle to thread. The most beloved expansions for the game, Heavensward and Shadowbringers, both benefited from following up on story threads that had been long established. People were already excited to go to Ishgard, and were already excited to go to the First. Taral, while already established in lore, is such an unknown quantity that this expansion is positioned more like A Realm Reborn, giving us a whole new world to explore, learn about, and, hopefully, fall in love with. In a sense, I think this was a good idea. Endwalker escalated things so much that to attempt to further escalate them would be meaningless, but I would argue that this makes Dawntrail's job even more difficult to pull off. De-escalation of stakes is a lot harder to pull off than escalation is. So is Dawntrail successful? Does it manage to make a whole new world that will be as beloved as Eorzea or the First are? Well, Dawntrail has been out for a few weeks now, and I've been playing a lot of it. I've completed the main scenario quest, reached level 100 on Reaper, Pictomancer, Warrior, and White Mage, gotten familiar with the Expert Roulette dungeons, spent some time crafting and gathering, the works, and I would say yes and no. I'm having a really great time with Dawntrail so far, and I look forward to playing a lot of this game over the next few years with my friends, but I think there are some issues here, specifically narrative ones, which deserve criticism. Let's get into it, shall we? Dawntrail is not a reinvention of Final Fantasy XIV. If you've played Endwalker, this is going to feel extremely familiar. You have the MSQ, which takes you through each of the new expansion zones, has you run 6 new dungeons and 3 new trials, and then after that there are 2 more optional max level dungeons at the end. We have a new normal raid series, starting with patch 7.01, and we'll have another Alliance raid series starting in 7.1, with the 2 raid series alternating patches throughout the expansion cycle. There are 2 new classes introduced, Pictomancer and Viper. There are also some smaller quality of life updates, like the new face wear slot to let players wear glasses without them being bound to specific helmet slot items, the new playable female Hrothgar race, some armors being able to be dyed 2 colors at the same time, and perhaps most importantly, a graphical overhaul. That is obviously a lot of content, but with the exception of the graphics overhaul, it's also very much what the FF14 team have been delivering at the start of each expansion. I personally have not grown tired of the formula of FF14 expansions yet, so I don't have a problem with it being very by the numbers. Your mileage will vary, and I think calling 14 out for not trying enough new things is fair, but it's not something I'm personally feeling yet, especially since I've played enough MMO expansions that have tried to rework systems that are perfectly fine, and that's how you get Azerite armor from WoW or shotguns moving to the heavy slot in Destiny. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, and I don't think Final Fantasy XIV's formula is broken at the moment. One choice that I find frustrating about 14's expansions overall, which is not limited to just Dawntrail, is that often a lot of the biggest, flashiest, and most radical new features don't end up being implemented at launch. As an example, major features coming as a part of Dawntrail that are not yet implemented are a new field operation, the game's term for large-scale endgame zones like Eureka, Bosja, and Zadnor, this time called Shade's Triangle. There's a new deep dungeon coming this expansion, and new variant dungeons. There's an ultimate raid based on the Eden raid series coming down the line. There's also a new limited job called Beastmaster coming sometime in the second half of the expansion cycle. There's new lifestyle content called Cosmic Exploration. I think this is a new event like Ishgard Restoration from Shadowbringers based on what they've said, but they're being really cryptic about it, which makes me think there's some huge twist to it. I'm not saying I wanted all of this to come with the expansion at launch. I think it's not only reasonable, but smart of the FF14 team to have a solid plan for content to keep people coming back with each patch cycle, and I think it's okay to hold some new features back from the expansion launch. What I'm saying is that I think it's weird that the Final Fantasy XIV team often feels apprehensive of introducing any of their more atypical features, like Island Sanctuary, or Bosja, or Variant Dungeons, or Deep Dungeons, at expansion launch. The most interesting parts of a Final Fantasy XIV expansion mechanically are never introduced at launch. And I think that's a mistake, since there are plenty of players who play at each expansion launch for a month or so, and then put the game down for 2 years until the next expansion comes out. Getting one of these things out at launch, like the Deep Dungeon or the first content drop for the field operation, would have been appreciated, although it's not a fatal flaw. Again, this is not me picking on Dawntrail alone, I could say the same thing about Endwalker. What we do get, though, from a gameplay perspective, is spectacular. Let's start with Tural itself. I loved Endwalker, it's my second favorite expansion behind Shadowbringers, and it made sense to be traveling all over the world for a conclusion to a storyline like that expansion was, but man, there's something that just feels right about starting a new MMO expansion and having a new continent to explore. One landmass or region. Okay, technically 2 here with Yoctoral and Zoctoral, but you know what I mean. These zones are jaw-dropping. They are all aesthetic triumphs. I love that they took inspiration not from any one region of the Americas, but from several. From the forests of Kazamauka to the mountain temples of Urkopacha, each region is not only distinct and memorable, but utterly gorgeous. Safe to say, the art team outdid themselves this expansion, and the graphics overhaul is really noticeable. That graphics overhaul doesn't look like a whole new game, it's still recognizably Final Fantasy XIV, but the lighting specifically is improved enough that not only do the new areas and upgraded models look great, but even the old content has had some new life breathed into it, because it's exciting to see how much better everything you already know now looks. I also didn't expect it to be a highlight, but man, mounts in general and flying in specific really do feel a lot better, just because they lean now. The music is every bit as excellent as we've come to expect. The jazzy soundtrack of Taliolal was not at all what I'd been expecting, but it makes for great background noise while crafting or idling for whatever other reason. The second city also has a theme that causes me to involuntarily start nodding my head every time I hear it, which is the sign of a good theme. The zones all sound great, the dungeons sound great, really the only track that didn't click with me was the end credits theme this time around, and even then, it's fine. I'm never going to go out of my way to listen to it again, but it also doesn't, say, permanently replace the theme music of an entire zone, so it's generally inoffensive to me. One positive thing I have to say about the MSQ this time around is that I really liked the expansion's premise, lending itself to engaging with the cultures of these regions. Dawntrail is very much structured like A Realm Reborn, in that much of the expansion is set up to provide world building before the plot really kicks in. The idea of going to each major settlement to complete a task for them, like you're collecting gym badges, is a pretty solid motivator to get you to stop in each town without it feeling unnatural. I've seen it pointed out that this is based on a common activity for Japanese vacations, stamp rallies, which makes me wonder if gym badges have been based on stamp rallies all along and I just never realized it. Either way, it's a great way of justifying why we have to visit all of these places and cultures. The single biggest win for this expansion is the repeatable instanced content, the combat content. I'm happy to say that the new dungeons and trials are, without exaggeration, my favorite set they've ever done. There's not a single slouch mechanically or aesthetically. A lot of people complained that the dungeons in Endwalker felt a bit stale, which again, I wasn't personally feeling, but I can see where it's coming from. Even as someone who thought that the dungeons and trials in Endwalker were perfectly fine, I think this set is undeniably more engaging. The encounters this time around are a lot more unique and challenging, which feels like it was done in response to this criticism. I would personally like to see them break a little further away from the strict 3 bosses, X-trash encounters between strictly linear formula that all dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV have fallen into since, I think, Heavensward, but short of more experimental design, these dungeons are basically the ideal form of what dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV can be like under the current format. Given that those things are what you spend most of your time with Final Fantasy XIV doing, I think it's extremely important to stress how good the encounter design is here. If this is indicative of how fun the raids, dungeons, and trials yet to be released over the course of the expansion are going to be, I think Dawntrail will ultimately end up being fondly remembered, at least from a gameplay perspective. I played through the MSQ as Reaper, and that feels pretty much exactly how it did in Endwalker, just with a couple extra buttons to press at the end of your combos. I've also now leveled White Mage, Pictomancer, and Warrior to cap, and I'm enjoying all of them. Pictomancer specifically is really clicking with me. I think it's a lot of fun to play, with less of a rotation and more of a priority for what spells to cast when. You have a checklist of things to do, but what order you execute those actions in is largely up to you, and since some of them allow movement and some don't, you have flexibility of when to commit to a cast time and when not to. That's a really interesting and, I think, fun way of handling a casting class, and I'm planning on taking Picto into Arcadion as my main, at least for this first raid tier, to get a feel for it in max level content. Adding a second pure DPS caster to the game makes a lot of sense, and it feels better to me than Black Mage ever has. I would sort of liken it to what I want Summoner to feel like when I play that. Viper is a really wild job, which I also like, although I haven't put nearly as much time into it since I already have a melee DPS I'm happy with. I'll tell you up front, Viper starts with more button bloat than I've ever seen an MMO class begin with. There are just a ton of buttons to push, and every one of them hits you with a wall of text when you hover over it. The tooltips for both Viper and Picto are honestly extremely badly written and confusing and really need to be reworked. It makes Viper especially the most intimidating class to start in the entire game. Just setting up my bars correctly took the better part of an hour, and that was with me and a friend sitting in Discord together talking through each ability to make sure we understood it. The introduction quest for Viper does help with this to a degree, since it requires you to perform certain combos in order to continue, but it doesn't offer much help in how to do those combos, unfortunately. Once you work through that barrier, once you figure out what you're supposed to be doing, which doesn't take that long in the grand scheme of things, Viper is a ton of fun to play. It feels like it's designed to have both a high skill floor and ceiling, and so my hope is that once it's at max level, it'll be doing some of the highest damage in the game in exchange for how complicated it is to learn and execute correctly. I have not looked up how Vipers are performing in relation to the other DPS this expansion yet, so I have no idea if that's actually how it's going or not. Another thing I quite like this expansion are the new role quests. I really liked the first set of role quests introduced in Shadowbringers, but the ones in Endwalker felt less successful to me. They were very similar to the ones to hunt down Ardbert's old companions turned monsters in Shadowbringers, but in my opinion, less interesting, since we were just hunting down a generic set of blasphemies. Dawntrail's role quests have significantly broken away from that trend by not taking themselves seriously at all, at least based on the melee DPS role quest. These are bringing some real Hildebrand energy to the table, which I think was a fun decision that I support. Not everything needs to be serious and dour, and it's one of the places where I think the lighter tone Dawntrail was advertised as having actually managed to shine through successfully. But the elephant in the room here, which is what I've spent this video so far talking around, is to many players the most important part of the entire game. The main scenario quest, the storyline. The lead writer of Final Fantasy XIV from Heavensward through Endwalker, Natsuko Ishikawa, stepped back for Dawntrail, with Daichi Hiroi taking her place. Hiroi has worked on previous questlines like Return to Ivalice, Tataru's Grand Endeavor, the Bard and Black Mage questlines from Heavensward On, and the Pandemonium Raid series. This change in lead writers is a major upheaval for the game, and so in many ways, Dawntrail is setting the mood among the community for, potentially, the next decade of story. Unfortunately, Dawntrail has proven extremely divisive, much more than I'd expected it to. And I've got to be honest, I find the conversation around the main scenario of Dawntrail really frustrating. I've spent a lot of time reading takes on this expansion from the community, and while I do fall on the side that thinks this expansion has some big narrative issues, people who like it aren't Squeenix shills, and for that matter, people who hate it, which for the record I do not, aren't media illiterate. And we all need to stop throwing that term around just because it's the popular buzzword right now. It really is okay if people liked Dawntrail more than I did, or less than I did. I think my work has made it pretty clear that I love this game and its narrative, but if you've come here looking for me to blindly defend this expansion's problems, or to call this the death of the game, then I'm sorry, you're going to be disappointed. In order to talk about my thoughts on the storyline of Dawntrail, we're going to have to get into spoiler territory. There's no way around it. So if you haven't completed the MSQ and optional dungeons yet, and you're worried about spoilers, like, comment, subscribe, you know the drill. Maybe go look at my recent FF14 video about the near raids. Thanks for watching. Bye. Are they gone? So do you guys like Final Fantasy IX? I'm getting ahead of myself. Dawntrail is, more than any other expansion the game has ever had, including Stormblood, bisected into two very distinct halves. The thing that keeps striking me about this expansion is that the MSQ didn't feel like an expansion storyline. It felt somehow like both an expansion storyline and the following patch content storyline, or an entire second expansion all rolled into one. Even the stinger at the end of the first arc feels like it's setting up a patch content villain, except you've only hit level 95 by the time you get that stinger. I am by no means the first person to observe this, but Dawntrail is not structured like any of the Final Fantasy XIV expansions. It's structured extremely similarly to A Realm Reborn. The first half of the expansion features you traveling from region to region, solving problems on a local scale, eventually fighting greater, though still not literally world-ending threats, before the plot really kicks in and the villains start to take center stage around 2/3 of the way through the story. The plot really kicks in when your base of operations, the Waking Sands in A Realm Reborn, Tuliolal in Dawntrail, is surprise attacked, and you end up marching into the Heart of Darkness to stop an invading army, Gaius' faction in A Realm Reborn, Alexandria in Dawntrail. It's not a perfect one-to-one, but it is very similarly structured. The main character of the two storylines even have the same initials, Warrior of Light and Wook Lamont. There's no doubt in my mind this is a deliberate choice. It's meant to show how far we've progressed over the original 10-year arc. The reason Wook Lamont is the main character of this storyline is because we are meant to be taking the Minfilia or Louisoix role, the mentor shaping a new hero from behind the scenes. It is deliberate, it is considered, and in a non-interactive medium, I don't think it would be a bad idea. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy XIV is actually a video game, and we are not playing as Wook Lamont. And that, I think, is why it feels like so many people have latched onto hating Wook Lamont. Let me set the record straight. I think Wook Lamont is fine. She's by no means one of my favorite characters in the game, but I hold no hate in my heart for her. I think her storyline about learning to have confidence in her own abilities and learning about her people in order to become a better ruler treads a lot of ground the game has already covered with characters like Reen or Lise, but that is not the same thing as saying I think it's pointless garbage. I think there are some awkward line deliveries, including one egregiously bad line delivery, you know the one, but I don't think that's isolated to just her in this expansion. I think the direction for the English cast did her dirty. The problem is not Wook Lamont. The problem is that none of the other characters feel like they get a chance to do much of anything except function as bodyguards and moral support for Wook Lamont. The Scions seriously could have been written out of this story entirely, or at least written out until Alexandria attacks in the final third, and very little would have changed. The writers were in a difficult spot here. On the one hand, this story being about Wuk-Lamat means that Wuk-Lamat needs to be the one to solve her own problems. Not only would having the Warrior of Light or the Scions do everything for her have some light white savior stink, it would also just be unsatisfying as a narrative. This is a story about Wuk-Lamat growing as a person, at least on paper, so having the Scions hand her victory would be a worse story. The problem, I think, is that they overcorrected. And so, other than helping us along in dungeons, it doesn't feel like any of the Scions except Kryl have any connection to the plot whatsoever. I really think the best solution here would have just been to put the Scions on the back burner for an expansion, introduce us to an entirely new cast aside from Kryl, and not bring the Scions back until patch content or later. Another problem that Dawntrail runs into is that the pacing of this expansion is bad. I said before that the expansion is structured very similarly to A Realm Reborn, but user Cyberfunk3 on Reddit ran the numbers, and where A Realm Reborn has a total of 9 hours and 45 minutes of cutscenes, Dawntrail has a total of 21 hours and 7 minutes of cutscenes. That's more than double what A Realm Reborn or Heavensward had, nearly double the length of Stormblood, which people already accused of feeling bloated. The only expansion that's eclipsed Dawntrail in cutscene length is Endwalker, which had 23 hours and 37 minutes of cutscenes. But Endwalker, in my opinion, did not feel as slow because it was the culmination of a ton of different story threads. In other words, it had more story than Dawntrail did. Final Fantasy XIV is, even at the best of times, a very slow burn. That can be okay when you're in an expansion like Shadowbringers or Endwalker that players are already sold on, and with what feels like an appropriate amount of moments of excitement spread throughout the whole expansion, but Dawntrail is much more uneven than either of those expansions. There are literally hours and hours of cutscenes that don't really serve a purpose other than to restate what we already know. There are moments of genuine brilliance in Dawntrail's story. The moment I saw Alexandria from Final Fantasy IX, the moment when Vritra flies in to stop Zoralja's army, the reveal of what the Skydeep Cenote really is. These are moments I'm going to remember for a long time to come. There aren't any moments that touched my heart in the way stories like Emmett Selk's or Fandaniel's did in previous expansions. There's nothing that has me so excited that I'm like, oh god, I've got to make a lore video about that right now. It's so good. But there are moments that had me dialed in and excited to see what would happen next. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of busy work. Literal chores you're performing in the actual narrative of the game. Dawntrail pulls a similar trick to Endwalker in that the advertised story about the Rite of Succession is only actually the plot for the first 5 levels before it takes a hard left turn. I don't think this is nearly as successful here as it was in Endwalker for a few reasons. In both expansions, it becomes pretty clear when you walk into what should, by all rights, be the end of the storyline, in Endwalker killing Zodiark, and in Dawntrail helping Wuk-Lamat win the throne, that you're really only halfway through the expansion, because you know from a meta perspective that you're only halfway to the new cap, and that you haven't been to half of the zones yet. Endwalker, I would say, pulled this trick off purely because of how bold it was. Everyone I know who has played Endwalker has gotten to that point saying, there's no way that Zodiark can actually be the first trial. There's no way they'd do that. Only to find that, yeah, they did. It works there because it feels like the story you expected has completely flown off the rails, and you have absolutely no idea what is coming. In Dawntrail, this doesn't work because, first of all, they just did it one expansion earlier, it's no longer surprising, and second of all, it doesn't feel like a subversion on the story you were expecting. It feels like that story just ended early, and a completely different story started up. Here's the thing I'm going to say in this video that's going to make people angry at me. Pacing issues aside, I actually think the first arc, The Rite of Succession, is the better written of the two storylines in Dawntrail. I was sold on a summer vacation, a relatively low-stakes romp through the new zones and new cultures, and the first half of the expansion is that. I like the setup for the new expansion. I immediately picked up on the idea that the point of the trial was to make a new candidate worthy of the throne by making the flawed contestants go out and interface with the people firsthand, and I think that's a pretty smart way of doing this storyline. It also really sells Galul Jaja as being this wise king that he's supposed to be. I think he might actually be my favorite character of the expansion. Yes, it's badly paced. I didn't need 6 quests about Wuklamot learning to catch alpacas, but in terms of what the story is actually doing, I think it generally works. The climax of this first arc being the Skydeep Cenote and the reveal of how Blessed Children are being made was also, without a doubt, the part of the entire expansion that had me dialed in the most. Overall, I think this arc actually worked for me, and by the end of it, I was interested in seeing what the City of Gold really was, and really wanted to figure out what was up with Zeralja. Then, at the end of this first arc, just when the pacing is starting to pick up, just when the story feels like it's starting to kick in, it all grinds to a halt. Without a doubt in my mind, the nadir of this expansion is the 4th zone, Shaloni. I would be hard-pressed to name a zone in the entire game with a worse MSQ experience than Shaloni. It is so slow, and so boring, and so disconnected from the rest of the expansion, that it was, I mean this, making me sleepy. Nothing story-relevant happens there until the very end when the dome appears. The MSQ, which already had pacing issues, absolutely grinds to a halt for hours right after the Skydeep Cenote reveal about the Blessed Siblings and a huge tease for Zeralja, both of which had me interested so we can go play cowboys with Estinian for a while. If I were not playing this in part to cover it for the channel, I would have started skipping cutscenes during this part, and if you know me or my channel, you know how bonkers that statement is. They're literally using rubber bullets so there aren't even any consequences for the Old West duels. Why are the characters here all play acting like they're in Westworld? This is not supposed to be a vacation for them. I hate it. Then you get through Shaloni, the dome goes up, and the arc begins at level 97, 2/3 of the way through the expansion. At this point, we've basically got a whole other expansion to play that only plays out over the course of the final third of the runtime. I get why they held back Heritage Found and Alexandria and all of the cyberpunk stuff. They wanted this to be a big surprise to players, to have a crazy moment where we suddenly shift from fantasy to sci-fi. Of course, they ruined that twist by showing both Heritage Found and Solution 9 months in advance, so it didn't work at all. Even if the twist had landed, I don't think it was a good idea. Surprise is something which I think is generally overvalued by storytellers. The twist, the moment of shock, can be great, but it is ultimately fleeting. The Sixth Sense is not a great movie because of its twist. It's a great movie without that twist, which gets to be just a little bit better because of it. In order to make the final third of this expansion surprising, they sacrificed a narrative that is coherently connected between its two halves. The surprise they bought by suddenly introducing cyberpunk elements was not worth what they paid for it. Zeralja is the biggest disappointment of the expansion to me. I kept expecting big things from him from the jump, ever since it was teased that he would be the real big bad, but we never really get there. By the time we kill him, it just feels like he is a bloodthirsty, power-hungry, and generally bad person, and that's all there is to him. He's like what people who hate Xenos think Xenos is. I've spent a lot of time talking about the villains of Final Fantasy XIV on this channel. They tend to be, in my opinion, very strong, very interesting, but Zeralja just feels utterly flat to me. Of course, that's because he isn't the final villain after all, it's Sphene, which you can see coming from a mile away, but that leads into another issue. The story of Dawntrail so completely can't figure out what it wants to be about, not thematically, but literally, that we surprise pivot villains not once, but twice. First from Bakul Jaja, then to Zeralja, and then finally to Sphene. This means none of them are coherent characters, and Sphene is specifically introduced so late into the expansion that all of Wuk-Lamat's comments about, "I know Sphene well enough to realize she's a good person deep down," feels like it's coming out of nowhere. So, the final act of the expansion is essentially a completely different story, mostly unrelated to what came before it. I am seeing more positivity online for this final act of the expansion, and I totally get why. The pacing is still bad, but it's bad in a different way. They waited so long to let the plot kick in that they have to cram a ton of world building and lore and plot into the last third of the expansion, which leaves it feeling completely overstuffed. At the same time, after Shaloni, the breakneck pace with which new concepts, new characters, and literally an entirely new world are being introduced to us feels like a breath of fresh air since things are, happening. Heritage Found and Living Memory are heavily inspired by elements of Final Fantasy IX. I will admit that while I've played Final Fantasy IX, and I like Final Fantasy IX, it's not one of the ones I've revisited past my first playthrough, so my memory of it is relatively fuzzy, but even then, I picked up on and was generally excited by the idea of seeing the world of 9 and ideas from it brought into 14 like this. The moment you crest that hill and see the flooded version of original Final Fantasy IX's Alexandria is spectacular. I think Heritage Found is the strongest zone overall in the MSQ, although I still think the second half of Yaktel, the Mamook arc, had me more dialed in. Things are happening, the aesthetic takes a sharp left turn into cyberpunk, Solution 9 is a great location visually, I think Otis is one of the best characters of the expansion, and seeing how the cultures of Alexandria and Yassilani have integrated into each other works great. The plot beat of regulators and their consumable souls might be my favorite idea in the entire expansion. Throughout the first half of the story, Wuk-Lamat is both learning and preaching the value of understanding through communication. The various feats she has to complete for the competition force her to understand different cultures, but nothing she sees is as alien as the use of regulators is. Recreating the cycle of reincarnation in a closed system, and scrubbing the memories of citizens to make them forget anyone who died in order to spare their entire civilization, the concept of grief feels genuinely blasphemous. It's the kind of thing a culture would go to war to stop. I like this because the regulators, while bizarre, are ultimately harmless and sustainable. All they're doing is exactly what the cycle of reincarnation already does, just in a closed system. What we're seeing here is something that challenges both the Scions and Wuk-Lamat's message of understanding, because it's a cultural thing which is extremely off-putting to our heroes' societies. I wish we'd gotten more time seeing Wuk-Lamat specifically have to reckon with this. While she acknowledges that the system, the commodification of souls, makes her uncomfortable, she also pretty immediately reminds everyone that it's harmless and that they shouldn't judge another culture if their practice isn't hurting anyone. This system also raises a lot of interesting questions about identity that the story doesn't go into. I think it's very possible that either the normal raid series, which is going to be set in Solution 9, or the patch content will explore this, but what Alexandria is doing here, placing someone else's soul back into your body, and then writing a backup of your memories onto it, is actually really interesting, because it implies that every time someone in Alexandria dies, they really do die, it's just a copy of them that gets back up and walks around. There's no continuity of experience, it is someone else taking your place, they just act exactly like you. Because of this, the extremely callous way the citizens of Alexandria treat death, with at least one character casually dying and then resurrecting with a beast soul as a combat tactic, is really fascinating to me. It reminds me a lot of the recent/ongoing Krakoa arc in the X-Men comics, but to an even more alien degree, because we are essentially dealing with a society who don't actually understand what death is. both because it appears impermanent to them from the outside, and because they don't have to deal with the after effects of grief when someone does die a final death. This is the most interesting idea in the entire expansion, and I really hope we get deeper into it over the course of the expansion post-MSQ. What I think is much less successful is Living Memory, the sixth and final zone of the expansion, with the concept of the Endless. The Endless are a distinct concept from resurrecting people with regulators, but I've seen people confused or conflating the two, and I think that's just because the expansion dumps so much lore at you suddenly in the final act that your brain gets a little overloaded. If I understand correctly, the Endless are the real reason why all memories of those who have experienced final death are purged from the citizens of Alexandria. They are creating AI constructs based on the memories of those who have died, both the actual first-person memories from their lives, and the second-person memories of how they are perceived by others for accuracy. These AI constructs get to walk around as, like, magic hard-light holograms in a remnant of the original Alexandria, in whichever reflection that culture is originally from. It's like a mix of the Black Mirror episodes Be Right Back and San Junipero. Although, to be clear, I'm not saying they got the idea from Black Mirror, nor that Black Mirror was the first piece of media to have either of these ideas. I'm just comparing it because it's something people know. The problem is that maintaining the Endless also requires living souls, or living ether, and unlike resurrecting people in Alexandria, it's not sustainable. They are actually burning the living's ether for fuel in a way that's not renewable, sacrificing the living to maintain the dead. What's more, the game is very, very, very clear that the Endless are not actually the people who died. They are just AI recreations of them. Again, this raises a lot of questions about identity. If you have a perfect recreation of someone, and if it's advanced enough to feel emotions and think creatively, how is that actually different from a person? Have you created life? And for that matter, is there any way for us to know if the Endless actually do have emotions, or if they're just programmed really well to pretend that they do? Unfortunately, the MSQ doesn't seem to have all that much interest in exploring these questions of identity, and it feels like it uses the "they're just AI constructs" lore to avoid needing to grapple with the question of whether we might have accidentally done a little bit of mass murder while shutting down the servers in the final area. A lot of people online have observed that our justification for shutting down the Endless, they're not real people and we need to sacrifice them to protect our own, is very similar to Emmett Selk's justifications in Shadowbringers for killing the people of the Source and the Reflections. I do not consider you to be truly alive, ergo I will not be guilty of murder if I kill you. Moral relativism. Making that parallel is certainly possible, but I think the perspective the game is taking is clearly different. In Shadowbringers, Alphino says to Emmett Selk,
"We understand, truly, but it makes no difference. The ones you love are in the past, while ours are here in the present."
The characters who are ideologically aligned here are not the Warrior of Light and Emmett Selk, they're Sphene and Emmett Selk, as both seek to sacrifice the living to bring back the dead. That's why, regardless of what some people seem to think, the game isn't actually being thematically inconsistent here. Living Memory is very similar to Ultima Thule. Yes, the fundamental difference is that Ultima Thule actually created living creatures made of dynamis. They were just created in the image of past civilizations, but you're still interacting with the echoes of the long dead. Plus, the final dungeon is, once again, walking through the memories of a civilization at the moment of its fall. I like the Alexandria dungeon as a dungeon. I like that the boss fight parts have you getting temporarily pulled partially out of the Matrix to fight antivirus software, but at this point we've done this exact same idea at the end of Shadowbringers, and at the end of Endwalker, and at the end of Endwalker's patch content, and it's just not working anymore. I love the dead ends. I think it is different enough from Amarat to justify its existence, but that was only the second time we'd done that, and now this is the fourth. This is why I say I think the first arc is more successful narratively than the second. The first arc's biggest sin is being slow-paced and kind of boring for large parts of it. The second arc, though, has all of these interesting setups, Zeralja, the Regulators, the Endless, but it ends up feeling so rushed, since it only actually takes place from levels 97 to 100, that it feels overstuffed with ideas, and it doesn't fully explore any of them, instead choosing to repeat things that we've already seen done better in previous expansions. It really feels like this should have been two different expansions. One set in an expanded 6-zone version of Yoctoral, which only focused on the competition arc, and one set in an expanded 6-zone version of Zoctoral and Alexandria, so that the Alexandria arc could have had more time to grow into its own. I would have been a lot nicer to Shaloni's story if it had been the first zone of the expansion, and not the fourth. And, of course, by the end of the story, with the final trial, we're fighting Sphene over the sake of the entire multiverse, since she plans to travel across all of the reflections, and one by one bleed them dry of living ether until they're all left empty, to sustain her endless as long as possible. I think escalating things this much so soon after Endwalker was a mistake. Dawntrail was advertised as a summer vacation, and that's what I was hoping it would be. I was hoping after Endwalker, FF14 would take the opportunity to de-escalate the stakes back to something on a smaller scale. The first half is that. It would be bad if Zeralja had gotten the throne because he would have started a war with Eorzea, but it wasn't the stakes of all life in the multiverse. The second arc, well, the final third, is that escalation, right back to fighting to save the multiverse like we were at the end of Endwalker, and I think that is inherently disappointing, and is the one thing that makes me genuinely worried about the future of this game's story. I don't think they get another chance to scale things back next expansion, since this was their chance to do that, so where can the stakes possibly go from here? All of this leaves me with this weirdly unsatisfied feeling at the end of the storyline. Like, all of the lore introduced in this expansion is stellar, 10 out of 10, but the actual story that lore is being used to tell never comes together. A lot of it is clearly set up for further expansions, like the key we get at the end, which was likely created by Azem in ancient times, since it has their symbol on it. That's going to let us go to other reflections in the future. There's the loose end of Preservation, who will presumably serve as villains over the course of this new arc, and there's the out-of-nowhere reveal that ancient Lalafell were able to leave the source and visit other reflections hundreds or thousands of years before the game begins. I'm glad we've got new mysteries to spend years of this game uncovering, but I don't think that helped this story on its own merits. You know what, though? My favorite moment of the expansion isn't even in the MSQ, so I'd like to close out this section of the video on a positive note by talking about one of the optional level 100 dungeons, Tender Valley. Throughout the whole MSQ, there's a vague implication that the Yaqui, the new race of giants introduced in this expansion, are the source's equivalent of the Ronkan Empire from Shadowbringers, who are long dead by the time we get to the first, and so we never get to see them. There are Yaqui automatons in the Skydeep Cenote that look like Ronkan automatons, a scene where we see murals painting the history of the Yaqui in Urkopacha mirrors the famous scene in some Ronkan ruins where Emet-Selch tells us the history of his people, and most subtly, throughout the expansion, whenever you get silver pieces to exchange for Gil, you aren't getting Allagan silver pieces, you're getting Nightworld silver pieces, the same ones introduced in Shadowbringers, since the Allagan Empire didn't have a presence on the first. I picked up on some of this myself throughout the expansion, but I wasn't completely confident that they were implying the Yaqui and the Ronkans were counterparts until Tender Valley, a dungeon set in Shaloni, which has you venturing into some ancient Yaqui ruins. Tender Valley is home to a giant lore reveal, but it's also a huge joke, and I love it to death for that. The first boss, a giant cactuar, pretty much functions to troll the player, since his attacks all telegraph much smaller than they actually hit, and he poses immediately after the attacks go off, just to say, "Joke's on you." It's gameplay as comedy in a way that's hard to pull off, and so I find it impressive here. When you do finally reach the Yakui ruins in the last third of the dungeon, they are reminiscent of the entrance to the Katana Revel, and the very last trash pull of the dungeon even directly pulls the unique mechanic from the trash in the beginning of the Katana Revel, where you have to hide behind walls to dodge the eye lasers of statues. Even if you missed all of the hinting that the Yakui and the Ronkins were related in the MSQ, this trash pull is meant to draw the connection in your brain at the last possible moment before the reveal. So you walk into the final boss room, and... the final boss is the Greatest Serpent of Teral, of course existing as a counterpart to the Great Serpent of Ronka, an adorable snake deity worshipped by the ancient Ronkins, who is both a supporting character in Raktika Greatwood's side content and a minion. Several minions, actually. I saw someone on Reddit, and I'm sorry if this was you, I don't remember what thread I saw it in, point out that the entire expansion has essentially been one big build-up to this joke, and God bless them, I love it so much. It's so good. It makes me happy. Gameplay as joke, joke as lore, lore as gameplay. You love to see it. This is, and I'm 100% serious here, 10 out of 10 perfect lore writing, and it didn't take a cutscene to pull it off. Okay, I'm writing this next bit later than everything that's come before it. Most of this video was written in the second week of the expansion, but given how important raid content is to an MMO, I decided any review of the expansion would be incomplete without at least covering the first raid released. In this case, the first 4 fights of the Arcadion. The Arcadion is a battle arena in Alexandria within the residential district of Solution 9. Let's cut to the chase. It's peak. The dungeons and trials had me very optimistic for the quality of this new raid, and I have not been let down. This is the good stuff, the kind of top-tier endgame content that will be what the expansion is remembered for. Right now, there's a lot of negativity floating around surrounding Dawntrail, but if the content coming over the course of the expansion is this good, Dawntrail is going to be remembered as a fantastic expansion with a mediocre MSQ. All 4 fights are great. The soundtrack is absolutely gobsmacking. My gobs have been smacked, and the storyline is surprisingly compelling for what amounts to Final Fantasy XIV's tournament arc. The Arcadion was teased in the main scenario quest for Dawntrail as a combat arena where those using regulators power themselves up using the souls of animals in order to fight for glory and fame. I'm glad this is what they've chosen to focus on for a raid series, because there's a lot to explore with the use of regulators that never really gets brought up in the main story. The first tier of this raid is about the light heavyweight bracket, and presumably will be progressing through a new bracket each tier, so in about 8 months, when the second tier gets added, we'll be fighting through the heavyweight bracket. Because the fighters in the arena are using beast souls in order to fight, each boss ends up being a fusion between the fighter and some animal or monster. What I'm saying is, congratulations to the furry community, you guys will be eating well for a while. Part of the fun of a tournament arc is, of course, getting to see the fighters, and in a fantasy story, what powers they get. Our set of bosses here are Black Cat, Honey Bee Lovely, Brute Bomber, and Wicked Thunder, each of whom have a really memorable design and unique and fun mechanics. Black Cat's most unique mechanic is attacking the platform in order to damage and then break individual panels on it. Because of this, players have to be aware of where they're going to be knocked back, and be careful not to break platforms themselves, fall out of the arena, or worse yet, box the rest of the group into a bad position. Honey Bee Lovely is portrayed as an idol, and her mechanics are built around charming the group, and sometimes around using her simps to attack you from outside the arena. 10 out of 10. Masterful work. I really like the Honey Bee Lovely live phase, where you're presented with these 3 empty hearts above your head, and for each attack you get hit by, one of them fills. If all 3 fill, you're charmed and stunned for a decently long duration, which, given how busy this fight is essentially a death sentence. The trick here is that some damage is mandatory, so your group has to be really careful about who is soaking circles and not to overlap anything, and the whole phase closes with a final attack where hearts slowly float across the arena like near bullets, which can get incredibly hectic. The third fight of the series is Brute Bomber. This is probably the most straightforward of these fights mechanically. It's a lot of stuff we've seen before, just at a very fast pace. The attacks Brute Bomber uses don't feel arbitrary, they feel like they communicate the character's personality, particularly his charge across the room, damaging one side and then charging again to damage the other. He will sometimes do the same side of the arena twice in a row, which feels like he's actively trying to trick the player, throwing them off in a way that fits his character. I really like the beat in the fight where he starts juicing and a ref tries to disqualify him, only to get thrown out of the ring. Wicked Thunder, the final boss of the tier, is certainly the hardest of the fights. It's the only one I've seen a wipe in so far. There's a lot going on in this fight, but the most unique thing is a mechanic where she'll pull out a giant cannon, aim it at one side of the room, and start blasting. If you're not quick, you not only take a ton of damage, but you fall to your death, as all but a sliver of the platform gets destroyed. This feels like it's about as hard as normal raids can/should get, and I mean that in a positive way. Also, let it be known, this raid soundtrack is so good it should be illegal. We've got 4 fights here, and each fight has its own completely unique background music in different styles. My personal favorite is Honey Bee Lovely's song Be My Honey, which is an upbeat idol pop song that I have been listening to a completely normal amount since this raid was released. Just think of a normal number of times to have listened to this song. That's how many times I've listened to it. The song features Honey singing to you about how you need to heed her well or you're as good as dead. I love the trope of a boss fight where the music is the boss singing their own theme song to you, so this has quickly become one of my favorite tracks in the entire game. Another great feature of this raid series is the announcer, who actually comments on the group's performance as the fight goes on, with lines for when the group dodges/fails mechanics, limit breaks, etc. This was a great idea that made the fights feel even more dynamic than they already would have. One thing that did surprise me is that I think the writing on this raid tier so far is a significant step up from Dawntrail's MSQ. I honestly expected this raid to be very story light, since the setup is just we're fighting in an arena to earn powerful equipment and to have the souls used by the arena set free. Our main character, aside from our player character for this raid so far, is Black Cat, or Yana, the very first boss we fight in this raid, a low-ranked fighter in the arena. I think the stuff with her sister, a former fighter who disappeared, is interesting. In the reveal of why she disappeared, the discovery that the fighters are contracting a terminal illness from the long-term use of beast souls is compelling. So far, this arc is setting up a story about the way athletes are mistreated, and the way that mistreatment is covered up by the institutions that profit from them. That's a pretty heavy topic, but a very relevant one given the recent discussion of mistreatment of those involved in pro wrestling that's been in the water lately. Since this raid series is set up to basically be a sports anime, that's a really interesting topic, and it seems so far like this storyline is really going for it. That said, I'm not a wrestling guy, so I don't have a lot more than that to say about it just yet. I think the story so far about sisters who have been torn apart by a system for profit is more compelling than the much grander scale and overall messier story of the MSQ, and I'm excited to see where it goes overall. I was already feeling good about this expansion's endgame before the raid came out, and right now, I'm more excited than ever. All of this is my very long-winded way of saying, I think the story of Dawntrail has problems, but I think once you get to the end game, Final Fantasy XIV has never been better. I think at the end of the day, the playable content being good is more important to the health of the game than the quality of the MSQ, because that playable content is what most people are going to end up spending more time with. It is unfortunate that Dawntrail does not make a better first impression, and does not end up meeting the expectations set by expansions like Heavensward, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker narratively. But I'm still willing to chalk it up to growing pains like A Realm Reborn had, and I'm still on board to see where we're going next. In conclusion, it's better than Lightfall or Warlords of Draenor, I'll tell you that much. You guys want to talk about bad MMO expansions? I've seen bad MMO expansions. This isn't one of them. If you're still watching this, I want to say thank you. It means a lot. My Final Fantasy content isn't usually structured like this. I tend to do long-form lore videos when it comes to FF14, but since Dawntrail came out and I had some thoughts on it, I had to get them out there. If you liked this video, consider checking out my last video about the story of the Yorha Dark Apocalypse raid series, where it succeeds and where it fails. Aside from that, please consider doing the old YouTube dance. Like, comment, subscribe, you know how it is. In my last video, I mentioned that I was getting really close to 20k subscribers, and that I was hoping that video would be the one to get me there, and sure enough, you guys did help me get there. So, once again, thank you. I'd like to give a special thank you to my YouTube channel members and Patreon supporters who have spent $5 and above to help me keep making content. Michael Beach, Mari SQZ, Unhealthy Caillou, Sean Kolb, Sir Darkon, Rachel Aurelia, Nathan Heel, Saivoafehi. If there's a specific way you want me to pronounce that, please DM me. I'll do it right next time. Jade Wang, Dotigore, Dan Luther, Lucky Tiger, Still Just Cow, Jose Armalas, William, Cabbage, Rekka, Alex Smith, Picayune, Hakan Boyam, Pete Lee, Knitend, Shiny Empty Head, That's All, Bell Mage, and Malachi Murphy. If you'd like to get your name read out at the end of videos, please visit patreon.com/Zuldim or hit the join button below. More videos coming soon, both Final Fantasy XIV related and not, so stay tuned for that. My current plan is for the next big video to be my long-promised video about Slay the Princess, although there will probably be some quicker stuff coming between now and then, and some supporter-exclusive content. Thank you all once again, and for now, I've been Zuldim. Take care.